Four nuns entered a small chapel near Trinity Forest for a weekend spiritual retreat, but they vanished without a trace. An exhaustive search involving hundreds of volunteers, cadaver dogs, and helicopters turned up nothing, and the case fell into a 23-year silence, becoming one of Northern California's most haunting mysteries. Until one quiet spring morning, when a priest visiting the abandoned chapel site heard something impossible, a faint hymn rising from beneath the earth. A discovery that would unravel a horrifying truth the ground had concealed for over 2 decades. The morning sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of St. Anthony's Catholic Church, casting a kaleidoscope of colors across the polished wooden pews. Father Michael Torres stood at the altar, his voice solemn yet steady as he concluded the memorial prayer service. "May the souls of the departed, through the mercy of God, rest in peace," he intoned, making the sign of the cross before him. "Amen," the congregation responded in unison. Father Michael looked out at the assembled faces. Many were elderly, their lined features etched with the weight of decades. Some were middle-aged, children when the tragedy first struck. A handful of younger parishioners sat scattered throughout the pews, drawn by curiosity about the local legend more than personal memory. All had gathered on this somber May morning to remember the 4 nuns who had vanished without a trace, exactly 23 years ago. The mystery had haunted the small community of Redwood Springs, California, nestled at the edge of Trinity Forest, for more than 2 decades. What had begun as a weekend spiritual retreat had ended in a disappearance so complete, so absolute that it defied rational explanation. As the service ended, Father Michael moved to the church entrance, greeting each member of the congregation as they filed out into the crisp spring air. Many offered their condolences, though after 23 years, the words had taken on a ritualistic quality rather than carrying the raw emotion of fresh grief. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Henderson," Father Michael said, clasping the elderly woman's wrinkled hands in his own. "Your presence means a great deal." "I always come, Father," she replied, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I can still remember Sister Dorothy teaching my grandchildren their catechism. Such a gentle soul, so patient with the little ones." Father Michael nodded, feeling the familiar pang of sorrow. Sister Dorothy Chun had been 66 when she disappeared, a lifetime of service to God cut short by whatever tragedy had befallen her and the other 3 nuns. One by one, the parishioners departed, each carrying a different memory of the missing women. Sister Margaret Flores, 69, whose homemade bread had been the highlight of every church social. Sister Dorothy Chen, 66, who had taught generations of children their prayers and catechism lessons. Sister Ruth Castellano, 29, whose beautiful singing voice had made every hymn feel like a gift from heaven itself. And the youngest, Sister Elena Torres, just 24 years old. For Father Michael, the wound ran deepest. Sister Elena had been his biological sister, his only sibling, and her disappearance had shaken his faith to its very core. When the last of the congregation had left, Father Michael slowly made his way back through the now empty church. His footsteps echoed in the silence as he moved toward his private office at the rear of the building. The space was modestly furnished with a simple desk, a bookshelf filled with theological texts, and a window overlooking the church cemetery where generations of faithful parishioners had been laid to rest. Alone at last, Father Michael sank into his chair and buried his face in his hands. The composed facade he maintained for his parishioners crumbled away, leaving only a man consumed by grief and unanswered questions that had plagued him for 23 years. "Why, Lord," he whispered, his voice ragged with emotion, "I have served you faithfully all these years. My sister dedicated her life to you. Why have you not led me to them? What lesson am I failing to learn from this trial?" Tears leaked between his fingers as his shoulders shook with silent sobs. He rarely allowed himself this moment of weakness, but the anniversary always stripped away his carefully constructed defenses, leaving him raw and vulnerable before God. After several minutes, Father Michael drew a deep breath and wiped his eyes. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and removed a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by countless hands over the years. Inside lay several photographs, preserved with loving care despite the passage of time. The first was of Elena on the day she took her final vows. Her young face beamed with joy and purpose beneath her veil, her dark eyes shining with a devotion so pure it had taken his breath away even then. Father Michael felt both pride and a stab of guilt as he gazed at the image. He had been the one to nurture her faith, to encourage her vocation. He could still remember their conversations when she was just 16, her eyes alight with conviction as she spoke of her calling to serve God. "I was so proud of you," he murmured to the photograph. "I still am." The thought that had haunted him for 23 years crept into his mind like a serpent. If he hadn't encouraged her religious vocation, would she still be here today? Would she be a wife, a mother, a teacher? Alive and well instead of, "In the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit," Father Michael said sharply, making the sign of the cross to banish the treacherous thought. He could not allow himself to question God's plan, even in his darkest moments. Setting aside Elena's photograph, he reached for another, the last known image of the 4 missing nuns. They sat together on a wooden bench outside the small, remote St. Catherine's Chapel near the edge of Trinity Forest. Sister Margaret and Sister Dorothy, the eldest, sat with their hands folded placidly in their laps, their lined faces serene. Sister Ruth sat beside them, her posture more relaxed, but her expression reverent. And beside her was Elena, the youngest, her eyes bright with purpose, even in this faded photograph. The photograph had been taken by a local hiker just days before the nuns disappeared. They had traveled to St. Catherine's Chapel for a short spiritual retreat, 2 days of fasting, prayer, and silence before the Feast of the Ascension. The diocese had also tasked them with assessing the old chapel's condition to determine whether it should be restored or decommissioned. Elena, with her eye for detail and her training in art history, had been asked to document the state of the structure. Father Michael stared at the image, his mind drifting to calculations he'd made countless times before. Sister Margaret would be 92 now, if she had survived. Sister Dorothy, 89. Even if by some miracle they had lived through whatever befell them, they would be frail, ancient women by now. But Ruth would be 52, and Elena just 47, still potentially in the prime of life. He remembered the frantic days and weeks after their disappearance. The police had searched the forest extensively, combing through underbrush and scaling the nearby mountainsides. Search parties had spread out through surrounding farms, villages, and towns. Helicopters with thermal imaging equipment had swept the area. Cadaver dogs had been brought in. The Coast Guard had even searched nearby rivers and lakes. But not a single clue had emerged. No scraps of clothing, no personal effects, no signs of struggle. It was as if the 4 women had simply vanished into thin air. The official theory had eventually settled on a tragic accident, perhaps a bear attack, or the women had gotten lost in the vast wilderness of Trinity Forest and succumbed to the elements. The area was known for its wildlife, including black bears and mountain lions that could become aggressive if threatened. But the complete absence of evidence had always made this explanation feel hollow to Father Michael and to many others as well. Over the years, uglier rumors had circulated, whispers that the nuns had abandoned their vows and run away to start new lives. Some suggested they had been involved in something scandalous, perhaps embezzling church funds or carrying on inappropriate relationships. Father Michael and the church hierarchy had worked tirelessly to quash such speculation, but the seeds of doubt had been planted in the community nonetheless. "Elena would never have done that," he whispered, tracing his sister's face in the photograph. "She would never have left without telling me. Her faith was too strong, her commitment too deep." As he continued to gaze at the photograph, his eyes drifted to the chapel in the background. St. Catherine's had been a simple structure, constructed in the 1920s to serve the scattered Catholic population in the remote areas near Trinity Forest. Its white walls and modest bell tower were visible behind the nuns, surrounded by the looming trees of the forest edge. Something tugged at Father Michael's heart as he studied the building. He hadn't visited St. Catherine's in over 20 years, finding the memories too painful to bear. The last time he'd been there was during the intensive search efforts, when he'd walked those forest paths calling Elena's name until his voice grew hoarse and his hope withered like leaves in autumn. But now, on this anniversary, he felt a strange urge to see it again, to walk where his sister had walked, to pray where she had prayed. Perhaps it was mere sentimentality, a desire to feel close to Elena on this difficult day. Or perhaps a small voice whispered in the back of his mind. There was still something to be discovered there, some clue overlooked in the initial investigation. The latter thought was almost certainly foolish. What could possibly remain to be found after 23 years? The forest would have reclaimed any evidence long ago. Animals would have scattered any remains. Time itself would have erased all traces. Yet the pull was undeniable, like a hand gently but insistently tugging at his sleeve. Father Michael carefully replaced the photographs in the box, except for the one of the 4 nuns at St. Catherine's, which he slipped into the inside pocket of his black jacket. He rose from his desk, collected his Bible and rosary, and left his office with purpose in his stride. In the church parking lot, he slid behind the wheel of his modest sedan, placed his Bible on the passenger seat beside him, and said a brief prayer for guidance. Then he turned the key in the ignition and pulled away from St. Anthony's, heading toward Trinity Forest and the ghosts of his past. The winding road leading from Redwood Springs to Trinity Forest carried Father Michael through changing landscapes that seemed to mark the boundary between civilization and wilderness. The town's neat houses and businesses gave way to scattered farms with grazing cattle and weathered barns, which eventually surrendered to the encroaching forest. Tall pines and ancient cedars crowded the roadside, their shadows dappling the asphalt as he drove deeper into the mountains. The journey took approximately 90 minutes, giving Father Michael ample time to reflect. He found himself recalling the numerous times he had made this same drive in the weeks following the nuns' disappearance. Back then, his car had been filled with missing person flyers bearing Elena's face, and his heart had been buoyed by desperate hope. Now he carried only memories and a resigned acceptance of the mystery that had shaped the last 2 decades of his life. As the road narrowed and began to climb into the foothills, Father Michael slowed his vehicle. St. Catherine's Chapel had been situated on a small clearing near the forest edge, accessible via a modest dirt road that branched off from the main highway. He scanned the roadside, looking for the familiar turnoff, his eyes searching for the hand-painted sign that had once marked the way. When he reached what he believed to be the correct location, Father Michael frowned in confusion. Instead of the simple dirt path he remembered, he found a paved private road blocked by an ornate wrought iron gate. A bold "No Trespassing" sign was displayed alongside smaller notices warning of private property and surveillance cameras. "This can't be right," he muttered, pulling his car to the side of the road and putting it in park. He consulted the photograph he had brought, comparing the background landscape to what he could see from his position. The distinctive peak of Mount Shasta in the distance matched perfectly, as did the particular arrangement of 3 tall pines on the ridgeline trees that had stood there for probably a century or more. This was indeed the correct location. But where was St. Catherine's Chapel? Father Michael exited his vehicle and approached the gate on foot. Beyond it, he could see the private road stretching into the forest, perfectly maintained and recently paved. The area appeared to have been extensively landscaped with ornamental trees and manicured shrubs lining the driveway, a stark contrast to the wild, natural setting he remembered. Bewildered, he reached for his cell phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for George Patterson, the longtime caretaker of St. Catherine's. They hadn't spoken in years, not since George had retired and moved to a small cabin nearby, but Father Michael hoped the man might still be in the area and able to provide some explanation. The phone rang several times before a gruff voice answered. "Hello, George? This is Father Michael Torres from St. Anthony's in Redwood Springs." There was a pause, then recognition dawned. "Father Michael? It's been quite some time. How are you holding up?" "I'm well, thank you," Father Michael replied, though it wasn't entirely true. "George, I'm standing at what I believe to be the entrance to St. Catherine's, but the chapel appears to be gone. Can you tell me what happened? Another pause, longer this time. When George spoke again, his voice was heavy with regret. That's right, Father. The diocese decommissioned the chapel years ago. Must have been around 1988 or so. It was sold to a man named Marcus Blackwell. He demolished it. Father Michael felt a chill despite the warmth of the spring day. I never heard anything about the chapel being sold, let alone demolished. Why wasn't I informed? Well, George said carefully, after what happened with the nuns, attendance dropped off significantly. People were afraid to go there, like the place was cursed or something. Then there was that incident with the bell tower cracking and nearly injuring poor Thomas Reed, the bishop. Decided it wasn't worth the upkeep for such a small congregation. That was too scared to even use it. Father Michael found himself staring at the no trespassing sign with growing unease. This Marcus Blackwell, does he still own the property? Oh yes, George confirmed. He's got quite a spread back there now. Built himself a big house, like one of those mountain lodges you see in magazines. His main residence is a ways in, near where the forest gets thicker. The chapel site is just part of his estate now, from what I understand. I see, Father Michael said slowly. I had hoped to visit the chapel today for personal reasons. It's the anniversary, you know. George's voice softened with understanding. Of course. It's been 23 years today, hasn't it? I'm sorry you came all this way for nothing, Father. I should have thought to call you over the years, let you know what happened. Do you know if Mr. Blackwell is generally receptive to visitors? Father Michael asked. Perhaps if I explain the situation, he might allow me to spend a few quiet moments where the chapel once stood. To be honest, Father, he's not known for his hospitality, George replied cautiously. Bit of a recluse from what I hear. Keeps to himself, doesn't mix much with the locals. Got a reputation for being, well, unfriendly is putting it mildly. Father Michael sighed, disappointment settling heavily on his shoulders. Well, thank you for the information, George. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with me. Listen, Father, George said, his tone brightening slightly. I still live nearby, not 15 minutes from where you are now. When the chapel was decommissioned, I saved some items before they demolished it. The old altar cross, some prayer books, a few statues, things like that. You're welcome to come see them if you'd like. Might bring you some comfort. That's very kind of you, Father Michael replied. Perhaps I will. But first, I think I'd like to try speaking with Mr. Blackwell. Do you know how I might reach his main house? George hesitated. Well, there's the private road you're looking at, but that gate's always locked and probably has cameras. There's a public road that loops around the backside of the property, though. It'll take you near enough. You'll see his place from there. Can't miss it, really. Big stone and timber structure. Looks like something out of a resort magazine. After receiving more detailed directions from George, Father Michael thanked him and ended the call. He returned to his car, conflicted about his next move. Part of him felt he should respect Marcus Blackwell's privacy and head straight to George's home instead. The man had made it clear through his signs and gates that visitors were not welcome. But a stronger impulse propelled him toward the public road that would lead to Blackwell's estate. He had come this far, driven by something he couldn't quite name. It would be wrong to turn back now without at least trying. 20 minutes later, Father Michael found himself driving along a narrow lane that skirted the edge of what must have been Blackwell's property. Through gaps in the trees, he caught glimpses of manicured grounds and eventually a substantial structure that resembled a luxurious mountain lodge more than a conventional house. The building was impressive, 3 stories of natural stone and rich timber with expansive windows and multiple terraces overlooking the forest. Solar panels gleamed on part of the roof, and Father Michael could see what looked like a professional landscaping job that must have cost a small fortune. It spoke of wealth that seemed at odds with the modest rural surroundings and the humble chapel that had once stood nearby. Father Michael located a small parking area near what appeared to be a service entrance to the property. He parked his car, straightened his clerical collar, and approached the imposing residence with a mixture of determination and apprehension. As he neared the front entrance, a stone pathway led him past carefully tended gardens displaying early spring blooms, tulips, daffodils, and hyacinths in vibrant colors. A small decorative pond featured a fountain shaped like a leaping fish. The craftsmanship of the place was undeniable, every detail speaking of money and refined taste. Yet Father Michael couldn't help but feel a sense of wrongness about it all. Where a simple house of worship had once stood, offering spiritual sustenance to those who sought it, now stood a monument to personal wealth and isolation. He climbed the steps to the front door and knocked firmly on the heavy oak panel, noting the intricate carvings of woodland scenes, deer, bears, eagles, etched into the wood. The door swung open almost immediately, revealing a tall, athletic man in his early 60s, dressed in expensive athletic wear compression shirt, designer running pants, high-end trail shoes. His silver hair was neatly trimmed, and in one hand he held a leather dog leash. The man's expression shifted from neutral expectation to unmistakable displeasure as he registered Father Michael's clerical attire. "Yes?" he asked, not bothering to disguise the impatience in his tone. "Good afternoon," Father Michael said with his warmest smile, determined to begin on a friendly note. "Are you Mr. Marcus Blackwell?" The man's jaw tightened. "I am, and you are trespassing on private property." "I apologize for arriving unannounced," Father Michael said quickly. "My name is Father Michael Torres from St. Anthony's Church in Redwood Springs." He extended his hand, but Marcus Blackwell made no move to take it. "What do you want?" Blackwell demanded, his fingers tightening visibly around the dog leash. Father Michael lowered his hand, maintaining his calm demeanor despite the obvious hostility. "I was hoping I might have a few minutes of your time. You see, I visited the site where St. Catherine's Chapel used to stand, and I was surprised to find it gone. I spoke with George Patterson, the former caretaker, and he mentioned you had purchased the property. I simply wanted to." "To what?" Blackwell interrupted, his voice taking on an edge that was almost a snarl. "Blame me for buying land that was legally for sale? Come here to lecture me about destroying a building that the church itself decided wasn't worth maintaining." He stepped forward aggressively, causing Father Michael to take an involuntary step back. "Are you one of those who thinks the ground is somehow sacred? The diocese didn't think so when they sold it to the highest bidder." No, Father Michael said quickly, raising his hands in a placating gesture. "I don't blame you at all, Mr. Blackwell. I wasn't even aware the sale had taken place. I was just curious about the circumstances. The chapel held personal significance for me, and I wasn't aware it had been demolished." Blackwell seemed momentarily mollified, though his expression remained cold as granite. "Well, now you know. It's gone, and good riddance to it. I sleep better now that I don't have to hear that blasted bell ringing 3 times a day and giving me migraines." Father Michael couldn't help but respond to this. "The Angelus bell is a beautiful tradition, Mr. Blackwell. It calls the faithful to recite the Lord's Prayer and honors the incarnation of Christ. It's meant to be a reminder of holy things, of our redemption, and God's love for us." "Oh, spare me the sermon," Blackwell scoffed, his lip curling in disdain. "People can set alarms on their phones if they need reminding to pray. They don't need to disturb the entire countryside with medieval noise pollution. That bell was an assault on anyone trying to enjoy the peace and quiet of nature." The conversation was clearly not progressing in a positive direction. Father Michael decided to try a different approach, seeking common ground. "I understand you value your privacy, Mr. Blackwell, and I've intruded on your time. I apologize for that. Perhaps we could speak another day when it's more convenient for you. I'd simply like to spend a few quiet moments where the chapel once stood, to pray for some people who were very dear to me." "There won't be another day," Blackwell said flatly, his tone brooking no argument. "I have no interest in discussing a building that hasn't existed for decades with a priest I've never met before. Now, I suggest you leave my property before I call the sheriff and report you for trespassing." Father Michael nodded, recognizing the futility of continuing. "Very well. Thank you for your time, Mr. Blackwell. Peace be with you." Blackwell's only response was to close the door firmly in his face. Not a slam, exactly, but decisive enough to make his feelings abundantly clear. With a heavy sigh, Father Michael turned and made his way back down the stone path toward his car. The encounter had left him feeling both disappointed and deeply unsettled. There had been something in Blackwell's manner beyond mere rudeness or desire for privacy that suggested a deeper, more visceral antipathy toward the church and its representatives. It was the kind of hatred that seemed disproportionate to simple annoyance about a bell. As he reached his vehicle, Father Michael glanced back at the imposing house. Was it merely his imagination, or was Blackwell watching him from one of the upper windows? The sensation of being observed prickled at the back of his neck, raising goosebumps on his arms, despite the warm afternoon sun. He slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, torn between returning to Redwood Springs and stopping at George Patterson's home, as the man had invited him to do. Perhaps seeing some of the preserved items from St. Catherine's would provide the closure he had sought by coming here today. As he drove away from Blackwell's estate, Father Michael found himself taking the road that would pass near the former site of the chapel. He couldn't explain the compulsion after all. He now knew there was nothing to see but landscape grounds and the memory of what had once been. But something drew him back in that direction, like metal to a magnet. The car rounded a bend, bringing him within view of the approximate location where St. Catherine's had once stood. Through a gap in the trees, he could make out a cleared area where the small building had been, now transformed into an ornamental garden with decorative shrubs and what looked like a small meditation grove. Suddenly, the car's radio crackled to life, emitting a strange, haunting sound that made Father Michael's hands tighten instinctively on the steering wheel. The sound was unmistakable Gregorian chant, the ancient, ethereal music of monastic worship. The Latin words were unclear, but the distinctive melodic style was impossible to mistake. But the radio was off. He distinctly remembered turning it off when he left Redwood Springs, preferring silence for his journey into these memories. Father Michael pulled the car to the side of the road and stared at the radio in bewilderment. The chanting continued for several seconds, a male choir. It sounded like their voices blending in the timeless harmonies of medieval sacred music. Then it faded away as abruptly as it had begun, leaving only static and then silence. "What on earth?" he murmured, reaching out to touch the radio dial. He turned it on deliberately, and a country music station blared to life. He turned it off again, but the mysterious chanting did not return. Had he imagined it? A trick of an exhausted mind, perhaps? Or some strange electrical malfunction in his aging vehicle? Yet, as he sat there, engine idling, a peculiar sensation washed over him, the same feeling he had experienced earlier, while looking at the photograph in his office. A tugging at his heart, an inexplicable certainty that he was meant to be here, now, for a purpose he did not yet understand. The hair on his arms stood on end, and a warmth spread through his chest. Physical sensations he had experienced before in moments of intense prayer or spiritual insight. In seminary, his spiritual director, Father Augustine, had taught him to recognize these as potential movements of the Holy Spirit, moments when God was trying to communicate something beyond words. "Lord, are you trying to tell me something?" Father Michael whispered, his eyes closed in concentration. As if in answer, the faint chanting emanated from the silent radio once more. This time, Father Michael was certain he wasn't imagining it. The sound was real, even if it defied logical explanation. It was as if an otherworldly voice was calling to him, guiding him towards something he needed to discover. Without fully understanding his own actions, Father Michael executed a careful U-turn and drove back toward the gate that blocked access to the former chapel site. Whatever was happening, whether divine intervention or simple coincidence, he felt compelled to investigate further, even if it meant risking another confrontation with the unwelcoming Marcus Blackwell. Some truths, he sensed, were worth the risk. Father Michael parked his car on the side of the road near the gate that marked the entrance to Marcus Blackwell's property. The no trespassing signs loomed before him, their warnings clear and unambiguous. He sat for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel, questioning the wisdom of what he was contemplating. "Lord, guide my actions," he whispered, his eyes fixed on the gate. "If I am about to err in judgment, show me the right path. But if there is something you need me to find, Give me the courage to seek it. But the strange sensation of spiritual prompting persisted, a gentle but insistent pressure that seemed to push him forward. After a final moment of hesitation, Father Michael exited his vehicle and approached the fence line, fully aware that he was considering an action difficult to reconcile with his moral obligations as a priest. Trespassing was wrong. Breaking the law was wrong. And yet, rather than attempting to breach the gate itself, which likely had cameras and alarms, Father Michael began to walk along the perimeter fence, seeking a vantage point from which he might view the former chapel site. The fence was substantial 8 feet of ornate but sturdy metal with decorative spear points at the top, but it followed the contours of the uneven forest terrain, occasionally dipping closer to the ground where the land rose beneath it. As he walked, Father Michael closed his eyes briefly, trying to visualize the layout of St. Catherine's as it had once been. If his memory served him correctly, the wooden bench where the nuns had been photographed had stood to the east of the chapel, near a large oak tree that had provided shade on hot summer days. Opening his eyes, he scanned the property beyond the fence, attempting to locate landmarks that might have survived the demolition and landscaping. The oak tree was gone, presumably removed during Blackwell's renovations, but a cluster of pines that had stood behind the chapel remained, providing a reference point for orientation. Father Michael continued along the fence line, moving carefully through the underbrush, his dress shoes ill-suited for the terrain. As he stepped over a fallen log, his foot suddenly caught on an exposed tree root, sending him stumbling forward with a startled cry. He reached out instinctively to catch himself, his hands grasping the metal fence. But the momentum of his fall caused his full weight to press against a section where the fence posts were set in particularly uneven ground. There was a sharp cracking sound as the weakened joint of the fence gave way. The bracket connecting 2 sections had rusted through, and Father Michael's weight was enough to break it completely. He found himself sprawling partially onto Blackwell's property, the broken section of fence twisted beneath him. "Oh, dear Lord," he muttered, picking himself up and brushing soil and pine needles from his black jacket and slacks. His heart was pounding, both from the sudden fall and from the realization of what had just happened. He had not intended to damage the fence, let alone create a means of entry onto the private land. Yet here he was, faced with an unexpected opportunity or temptation, depending on one's perspective. Father Michael glanced back toward the road, ensuring no one had witnessed his accidental vandalism. The area was deserted, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the afternoon breeze and the distant call of a crow. He looked down at the broken fence, then at the clearing beyond where St. Catherine's had once stood. The gap was just large enough for a person to squeeze through. "Forgive me," he whispered, crossing himself before carefully stepping through the opening in the fence. Once on Blackwell's property, Father Michael moved swiftly but cautiously toward the former chapel site, every sense alert for any sign of the property owner or security personnel. The area had been extensively landscaped with non-native ornamental plants, Japanese maples, decorative grasses, and flowering shrubs that seemed out of place against the backdrop of the natural forest. Nothing remained to indicate that a place of worship had ever existed here. No foundation stones protruding from the earth, no cross marking the spot, no memorial plaque or sign, nothing. The absence struck Father Michael as particularly sad, almost sacrilegious in its completeness. It was as if Marcus Blackwell had deliberately erased all traces of the chapel's existence, removing not just the building, but its very memory from the land. As he stood in what he estimated to be the center of where the chapel had stood, contemplating this erasure, a flash of reflected light caught his eye. Something near the ground, partially hidden by a decorative juniper shrub. Curious, Father Michael moved closer and parted the prickly branches to reveal a metal grate set into the earth, an air vent of some kind. It appeared old and weathered, its iron bars coated with rust and age, looking nothing like the modern construction visible everywhere else on the property. Father Michael frowned, perplexed. If the chapel had been completely demolished and the area landscaped, why would an old air vent remain? And why would a landscaped garden area with no structures visible need ventilation at all? He crouched beside the vent, examining it more closely. The design was definitely vintage, possibly dating back to the 1930s or 1940s, with ornate scrollwork around its edges that spoke of a time when even utilitarian objects were crafted with aesthetic consideration. It seemed completely incongruous with the sleek, modern minimalist aesthetic of Blackwell's property. As he leaned closer, peering through the rusted bars into the darkness below, a sound drifted up through the grate so faint that at first Father Michael thought he had imagined it. But then it came again, a soft, melodic humming, followed by what sounded distinctly like a human cough, weak and rasping, but unmistakably real. Father Michael's blood ran cold. He pressed his ear closer to the grate, hardly daring to breathe. The humming continued, a tune he recognized, one of the ancient Marian hymns, Salve Regina. The melody was wavering and broken, as if the singer's voice was weak from disuse or illness, but the sacred song was unmistakable. Someone was below ground. Beneath what had once been St. Catherine's Chapel, someone was singing a hymn. "Hello?" Father Michael called softly through the grate, his voice trembling. "Hello? Can you hear me?" But the humming continued uninterrupted, suggesting the person couldn't hear him from their subterranean location. The voice, definitely female, he thought seemed to come from far below, perhaps at the end of a long shaft or tunnel. Father Michael straightened up, his mind racing with disturbing implications. Why would there be an underground space beneath the former chapel site? The building had been constructed in the 1920s with a simple slab foundation, according to George. There had been no basement, no crypt, no underground chambers, which meant this had been built later, after the chapel was demolished, after Marcus Blackwell took ownership. And more importantly, who was down there? And were they there by choice? He looked around, half expecting to see Marcus Blackwell approaching with fury in his eyes, but the property remained quiet. The main house was hidden from this location by a stand of trees, and no security cameras were visible in the immediate vicinity, though that didn't mean they weren't there. Drawing his cell phone from his pocket with a trembling hand, Father Michael dialed 911. As the phone rang, he sent up a silent prayer that he was doing the right thing, that he wasn't overreacting to some innocent explanation he hadn't considered. 911, what's your emergency? A female dispatcher's voice answered. My name is Father Michael Torres, he said, keeping his voice low despite the apparent solitude. I'm at the property of Marcus Blackwell, near the former site of St. Catherine's Chapel off Route 89. He hesitated, suddenly aware of how strange his report would sound. I believe someone may be trapped underground. I can hear singing and coughing coming from an air vent. There was a brief silence on the other end. Sir, are you saying you suspect someone is being held against their will? I don't know, Father Michael admitted, but there appears to be an underground space of some kind, and someone is definitely down there. Given the remote location and the fact that this property is private, I'm very concerned. Are you on the property legally, sir? The dispatcher asked, a note of skepticism entering her voice. Father Michael winced. I accidentally damaged a section of fence and found myself on the property. I realize I'm trespassing, but this seemed like an emergency situation. I understand. What is your exact location on the property? Father Michael described his position as best he could, explaining that he was near where St. Catherine's Chapel had formerly stood, using the cluster of pine trees and the distance from the main gate as reference points. We'll send officers to investigate, the dispatcher assured him. Please remain where you are until they arrive, unless you feel you're in danger. Thank you, Father Michael replied, relief washing over him. I'll wait by my vehicle, which is parked on the roadside near the main gate. After ending the call, Father Michael took one last look at the mysterious air vent. The humming had stopped, but as he listened intently, he could still hear occasional sounds of movement from below, a shuffling noise, the scrape of something against stone. Someone was definitely down there, and the thought sent a chill down his spine. He made his way back to the broken section of fence, carefully squeezing through the gap and returning to the public road. As he walked toward his parked car, he dialed George Patterson's number, feeling an urgent need to gather more information before the police arrived. George, it's Father Michael again. I need to ask you something important. When St. Catherine's was still standing, Was there any kind of basement or underground room beneath it? George sounded surprised by the question. No, Father. The chapel was built on a simple slab foundation. No basement, no crypt, nothing like that. Why do you ask? Father Michael explained what he had discovered, the air vent and the sounds coming from below ground. That's impossible, George said firmly. There was never any underground structure at St. Catherine's. I maintained that property for 20 years. I would know. Then the only explanation is that someone built it after the chapel was demolished, Father Michael concluded. When Marcus Blackwell took ownership. That's disturbing, George admitted, his voice troubled. What are you going to do? I've already called the police. They're sending officers to investigate. I'll come too, George decided immediately. I know that property better than anyone. I can be there in 10 minutes. Father Michael thanked him and ended the call, then settled into his car to wait, fingering his rosary beads and murmuring prayers for whoever might be trapped beneath the earth where St. Catherine's had once stood. Father Michael sat in his parked car, fingers moving methodically over the smooth beads of his rosary as he recited the familiar prayers. The ritual brought a measure of calm to his troubled mind, though questions continued to swirl beneath the surface of his concentration. Who could possibly be below ground at the former chapel site? What purpose could an underground chamber serve in such a remote location? And most disturbing of all, could there be any connection to the disappearance of the 4 nuns 23 years ago? The last question seemed far-fetched even to Father Michael. 23 years was an impossibly long time for anyone to remain concealed underground. Yet the timing of his discovery on the very anniversary of the disappearance struck him as more than mere coincidence. And the voice had been singing Salve Regina, a hymn beloved by religious sisters throughout the world. A vehicle approaching from the direction of town interrupted his thoughts. It was a battered pickup truck that Father Michael recognized as belonging to George Patterson. The former caretaker pulled up behind his sedan and emerged from the cab, his weathered face etched with concern. Father Michael, George called as he approached. Any sign of the police yet? Not yet, Father Michael replied, stepping out to greet him. Thank you for coming so quickly. George nodded, his eyes scanning the road and the gated entrance to Blackwell's property. Been thinking about what you told me. It makes no sense. If Blackwell built something underground where the chapel stood, people would have noticed the construction. You can't exactly dig out a basement without heavy equipment and lots of noise. Unless it was done gradually over time, Father Michael suggested. Or perhaps there was already some natural cavity in the ground that he expanded. George shook his head doubtfully. This area doesn't have caves or anything like that. It's mostly solid bedrock beneath a few feet of soil. Trinity Forest isn't like Kentucky or New Mexico with those limestone caverns. Before they could speculate further, the distinctive sound of approaching sirens reached them. A police cruiser rounded the bend, lights flashing but siren fading as it pulled up in front of Father Michael's car. 2 officers emerged, one older with graying hair at his temples, the other younger and lean with an alertness in his movements that suggested military background. Their badges identified them as officers from the Shasta County Sheriff's Department. Father Torres? The older officer asked, approaching with a professional but not unfriendly demeanor. Yes, officer. Thank you for coming. Father Michael gestured to his companion. This is George Patterson, the former caretaker of St. Catherine's Chapel that once stood on this property. The older officer nodded in acknowledgement. I'm Deputy Williams, and this is Deputy Carter. Dispatch says you reported hearing sounds coming from an underground location on private property. Can you walk us through exactly what you discovered? Father Michael explained the circumstances that had brought him to the area of the memorial service. His decision to visit the chapel site, his conversation with George about the property being sold and demolished, his encounter with Marcus Blackwell, and the strange incident with his car radio. He described the spiritual prompting he'd felt, his accidental breaching of the fence, and the discovery of the air vent with sounds emanating from below. He was careful to emphasize his contrition for the trespassing, which Deputy Williams acknowledged with a small wave of his hand. Let's focus on the potential welfare issue first, the deputy said. If someone is indeed trapped or being held against their will, that takes precedence over a minor trespassing incident. George interjected. I maintained St. Catherine's for over 20 years before it was sold. There was never any underground structure associated with the chapel. Whatever is there now was built after Marcus Blackwell took ownership. The younger officer, Deputy Carter, who had been quietly taking notes, looked up. Mr. Blackwell is a prominent landowner in these parts. These are serious implications we're making. I understand that, Father Michael said solemnly. I'm not accusing Mr. Blackwell of anything specific. I'm simply reporting what I heard and expressing concern for whoever might be down there. Deputy Williams nodded thoughtfully. Fair enough. Let's take a look at this air vent you discovered. Mr. Patterson, since you're familiar with the property layout, would you mind accompanying us? Not at all, George agreed readily. The four men walked toward the damaged section of fence. Father Michael pointed out the gap he had inadvertently created, and they carefully made their way through onto Blackwell's property. Father Michael led them to the ornamental shrubbery that partially concealed the air vent. Here it is, he said, parting the branches to reveal the rusted grate. Deputy Williams crouched beside it, examining the vent with a practiced eye. This is definitely old craftsmanship. Doesn't match the modern landscaping at all. He pulled out his flashlight and shone it through the grate, but the beam disappeared into darkness after only a few feet. Deputy Carter joined him, adding his own flashlight. Can't see much. The shaft angles off after about 6 feet. Could go down quite a ways. Listen, Father Michael urged. Just be quiet for a moment. The four men fell silent, straining to hear any sound from below. For nearly a minute, there was nothing but the ambient noise of the forest birds calling in the distance, leaves rustling in the distance, leaves rustling in the ambient noise of the forest birds and the forest noise. For nearly a minute, there was rustling in the breeze, the creak of tree branches. Father Michael began to worry that whoever had been below had either moved away from the vent or had fallen silent upon hearing voices above. Then, faintly but distinctly, a woman's voice began to hum. The melody was haunting, archaic, a fragment of sacred music that Father Michael instantly recognized despite its broken, wavering quality. Salve Regina, Deputy Williams whispered, a flicker of recognition crossing his weathered features. George nodded in confirmation. Yes, the Marian antiphon, sung in monasteries and convents for centuries. The humming continued for several more seconds, then faded, replaced by the sound of labored breathing and a dry, rasping cough that spoke of illness or prolonged suffering. The officers exchanged significant glances. Deputy Carter straightened up, his expression now grave. That's definitely someone down there, and from the sound of that cough, they may need medical attention. We need to speak with Mr. Blackwell immediately, Deputy Williams decided, his tone shifting into full investigative mode. This is now a welfare check at minimum. I don't understand, George said, shaking his head in bewilderment. This air vent wasn't here when the chapel stood, and there was never any basement or underground room. How could anyone be down there? That's what we aim to find out, Deputy Williams replied. Let's head to Blackwell's residence. The four men made their way back to the road and their respective vehicles. Following the deputy's cruiser, Father Michael and George drove the short distance to Marcus Blackwell's main house. The imposing structure seemed more forbidding than ever as they approached, its many windows like watchful eyes surveying their arrival. Deputy Williams instructed Father Michael and George to remain by their vehicles while he and Deputy Carter approached the front door. Father Michael watched as the officers knocked and waited, tension evident in their postures despite their professional demeanor. Several moments passed before the door opened, but it wasn't Marcus Blackwell who emerged from the house. Instead, the group saw him approaching from the rear of the property, still dressed in his exercise clothes and leading a large German shepherd on a leash. His expression shifted rapidly from polite inquiry to barely contained fury when he spotted Father Michael and George standing near the officer's cruiser. What is the meaning of this? Blackwell demanded as he reached the front steps, his face flushing red. Why are these trespassers on my property again? Deputy Williams introduced himself and his partner, explaining the purpose of their visit in measured tones. We received a report of sounds coming from what appears to be an underground structure at the former chapel site. We'd like to ask you a few questions about that, sir. Blackwell's face flushed with anger. This is outrageous. First, this priest shows up uninvited. Then, he trespasses through my fence and onto my land. And now he's making wild accusations and wasting police resources. No one is making accusations. Mr. Blackwell, Deputy Carter said calmly. We're simply following up on a welfare concern. Someone appears to be in an underground space on your property, and they sound like they may need medical attention. That's absurd, Blackwell snapped, his hand tightening on the dog's leash until his knuckles turned white. There's no one on my property except me and my dogs. I would know if someone were living in a secret underground bunker? Do you realize how ridiculous that sounds? Nevertheless, sir, we're obligated to investigate, Deputy Williams said firmly. We'd like permission to check your home and the grounds, including any basement areas. Absolutely not. Blackwell's voice rose. This is private property. You have no right to search without a warrant. Mr. Blackwell, Deputy Carter began, his tone reasonable but insistent. If there's someone in distress on your property, even a trespasser you're unaware of, wouldn't you want to know about it? This could be a squatter who's found their way into some old structure you don't even know exists. Blackwell's eyes narrowed suspiciously. There are no old structures I don't know about. I've owned this land for over 25 years. I know every inch of it. Then what about the air vent near the former chapel site? Deputy Williams asked. The one? That appears to ventilate an underground space. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in Blackwell's expression. A momentary faltering that Father Michael caught before the man's face hardened once more into obstinate refusal. It was the briefest crack in his composure, but it was there, unmistakable to anyone watching closely. I installed a drainage system when I landscaped that area, Blackwell said dismissively. What you're calling an air vent is probably just a decorative grate covering a drain pipe. There's nothing sinister about it. Rainwater needs somewhere to go. A drainage system doesn't sing hymns or cough. Mr. Blackwell, Deputy Williams observed dryly. Blackwell turned his glare toward Father Michael, his eyes blazing with contempt. This man has clearly orchestrated this entire situation. He probably brought some device that plays recorded sounds and planted it near the drain. He's harassing me because he resents that I bought church property and demolished that eyesore of a building. I would never do such a thing, Father Michael protested, crossing himself. As God is my witness, I heard a woman's voice coming from that vent. We all heard it just now. Blackwell scoffed. A priest invoking God while trespassing and lying. How very typical of your kind. All piety on the outside, all deception within. That's enough, Mr. Blackwell, Deputy Williams said sharply. We're asking for your voluntary cooperation. If you refuse, we'll have no choice but to pursue other legal avenues. Then pursue them, Blackwell replied coldly. In the meantime, I want these people off my property immediately. If they're not gone in 2 minutes, I'll file trespassing charges against all of you, including you officers for exceeding your authority. Recognizing the impasse, Deputy Williams nodded to Father Michael and George, indicating they should return to their vehicles. The officers followed, walking back to their cruiser with measured steps that suggested this retreat was strategic rather than final. As they reached the police car, Deputy Williams spoke quietly to Father Michael. Don't worry, Father. This isn't over. I'm going to contact dispatch and request information on the property, deed, ownership history, and any prior complaints or incidents at this location. I also want to review the file on those missing nuns from 1985. Father Michael nodded gratefully. Thank you, Deputy. I know how strange this must seem, but I truly believe someone needs help down there. I believe you, the deputy replied. We all heard something. Whether it's exactly what you think, we'll determine that with proper investigation. Head back to George's place for now. We'll be in touch. The drive to George's home was brief, but tense, with both men lost in their thoughts about the mysterious voice beneath the former chapel grounds. George's house proved to be a modest cabin set back from the main road, surrounded by towering pines that cast long shadows in the late afternoon sun. Not much, but it's home, George said as he led Father Michael inside. The interior was simply furnished but comfortable, with well-worn furniture and walls decorated with fishing memorabilia and a few framed photographs. A worn leather Bible sat on the side table, and rosary beads hung from a hook by the door. "It's very welcoming," Father Michael replied sincerely, noting the cross hanging prominently above the stone fireplace. George busied himself in the small kitchen, preparing tea while Father Michael settled into an armchair. "I kept several items from St. Catherine's when it was decommissioned," George called over his shoulder. "They're in a trunk in the spare room. I'll show you after we've had our tea." Father Michael nodded, his mind still preoccupied with the air vent and the haunting voice that had emerged from it. "George, why do you think the diocese never informed me about the chapel being sold? I was at St. Anthony's all those years ago, and my sister was among the missing nuns. Surely someone should have consulted me." George returned with 2 steaming mugs, handing one to Father Michael before taking a seat opposite him. "The decision came from the bishop's office in Sacramento. I don't think it was handled well, to be honest. After what happened with the nuns, attendance dropped significantly. People were spooked. Then there was that incident with the bell tower. What exactly happened?" Father Michael asked, sipping the hot tea gratefully. "Structural failure," George explained. "The chapel was built in the 1920s, and maintenance had been minimal over the years. One Sunday morning in 1986, the bell tower developed a large crack. The old bell must have weighed 300 pounds. It came crashing down, nearly killed poor Thomas Reed, who was filling in as caretaker while I was laid up with a broken leg. Was anyone hurt? By the grace of God, no. But it was the final straw for the diocese. They declared the building unsafe and closed it immediately. By early 1988, they decided to decommission it entirely rather than pay for extensive repairs." Father Michael frowned. "And Marcus Blackwell purchased it soon after." "That's right. Paid cash, from what I heard, more than the land was worth, which raised a few eyebrows. But the diocese needed funds for renovations at the cathedral, so they didn't ask too many questions. What did Blackwell do with the property immediately after purchase?" George's brow furrowed in recollection. "Demolished the chapel right away. Had a crew out there within days. There were some protests from locals who thought the building could have been saved, but legally there was nothing they could do. After that, he started landscaping the grounds, but he never built anything substantial on the chapel site itself. Just turned it into that garden area you saw." "Did you notice any unusual construction activity?" Father Michael asked. "Anything that might suggest he was building something underground?" "Nothing obvious," George replied, then paused, his eyes growing distant with memory. "Although there was a period in late 1989 when people reported hearing strange noises at night, machinery running, that sort of thing. And some folks complained about tremors." Father Michael leaned forward, his interest piqued. "Tremors? Like earthquakes?" "That's what the authorities concluded. Minor seismic activity. But it seemed odd that it was so localized to that specific area. Some people wondered if Blackwell was doing some kind of excavation work, but no one could prove anything." "And no one investigated further?" George shrugged. "A deputy came out, looked around, found nothing suspicious, and that was that. Blackwell's always been well connected. Donates to the right causes, knows the right people. He made it clear he valued his privacy, and most folks respected that. The conversation drifted to other topics. The changes in Redwood Springs over the years, the Bayers, the declining congregation at St. Anthony's, and theological discussions that reflected both men's deep faith. Time passed swiftly, and Father Michael was surprised when his phone rang, breaking the comfortable rhythm of their conversation. "Father Torres speaking," he answered. "Father, this is Deputy Williams." The officer's voice sounded energized, purposeful. "I've made some progress. I spoke with Judge Martinez, who's sympathetic to our concerns. She's granted an emergency warrant for a welfare search based on a reasonable suspicion of unlawful confinement." Father Michael felt a surge of hope. "That's excellent news, Deputy. We'll be heading back to Blackwell's property within the hour. I wanted to let you know, though, I must advise you to stay away for safety reasons. This is now an official police operation." "I understand," Father Michael replied, though his desire to be present was powerful. "But Deputy, if you do find something or someone ... you'll be the first civilian I call," Williams promised. "This whole situation began because of your persistence, Father. I respect that." After the call ended, George overheard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. He insisted they should at least be able to observe from a distance, arguing that their spiritual presence might be important if something significant was discovered. With some reluctance, Deputy Williams agreed when Father Michael called him back. They could remain in their vehicle at a safe distance, but strictly as observers. An hour later, Father Michael and George parked along the public road near the entrance to Blackwell's property. From their position, they could see multiple police vehicles arriving. The original cruiser joined by 2 more patrol cars, a forensic van, and an ambulance staging nearby. The sight of the ambulance sent a chill down Father Michael's spine. Deputy Williams approached their car briefly. "We're going in with the warrant. I've set up my body camera to stream to this channel." He showed them how to access the feed on Father Michael's phone. "You can watch from here, but do not approach under any circumstances. Is that clear?" Both men nodded in agreement, and Deputy Williams returned to his colleagues. They watched through the phone screen as the assembled officers approached Blackwell's front door, warrant in hand. Blackwell answered, and even through the muffled audio, they could hear him protesting vigorously, threatening lawsuits and calls to his attorney. Despite his objections, the officers executed their search warrant, methodically examining the main house while Blackwell was kept under supervision in his living room. Father Michael watched every moment, his heart pounding with anticipation and dread. After approximately 45 minutes, Deputy Williams reported through the body camera that the house and conventional basement had yielded nothing suspicious. Moving on to the forest road and outbuildings now, Williams narrated for the benefit of those monitoring the feed. "Mr. Blackwell has confirmed there's a storage shed along the private road, connecting his main house to the former chapel site." Father Michael and George watched intently as the officers, accompanied by a visibly furious Blackwell, made their way along the forest road. The path was well maintained but narrow, winding between ancient trees that created a tunnel-like effect in the fading daylight. After about 15 minutes of walking, the camera showed a modest wooden structure, the storage shed Blackwell had mentioned. It was larger than Father Michael had expected, perhaps 20 feet square with weathered siding and a metal roof. "This is just a tool shed," Blackwell could be heard saying, his voice dripping with contempt. "Garden equipment, maintenance supplies, that sort of thing. Complete waste of your time and taxpayer money." The officers methodically searched the building, which did indeed contain an assortment of tools, lawn equipment, and gardening supplies. The space was dusty and appeared seldom used, with cobwebs in the corners and a musty odor that one officer commented on. As the search was nearing completion, there was a sudden noise. One of the officers had dropped a heavy wrench while examining a workbench, and it landed on the wooden floor with an unexpectedly hollow sound, a resonance that suggested empty space beneath. The camera panned down to show Deputy Carter kneeling, tapping experimentally on the floorboards. "This section sounds different," he observed, removing his flashlight to examine the area more closely. "These boards look newer than the others, too. Different type of wood." Despite Blackwell's renewed protests, louder and more agitated now, the officers began to remove the suspicious floorboards. Beneath them, they discovered a stone staircase descending into darkness, the steps worn smooth in the center from years of use. "Mr. Blackwell," Deputy Williams said, his voice carrying clearly through the body camera's microphone, "would you care to explain this?" Blackwell's face had gone pale, his earlier bluster replaced by tense silence. When he refused to comment, Williams instructed several officers to remain with him while he and Deputy Carter prepared to descend the staircase. Switching to tactical lights, Williams narrated as he activated a powerful flashlight mounted on his shoulder. "We're proceeding into what appears to be an underground passageway." The camera showed a narrow stone staircase that appeared to have been carved directly into the bedrock. The steps were worn in the center, suggesting regular use over a period of years, decades, perhaps. At the bottom of the stairs, approximately 20 feet down, a heavy wooden door blocked further progress. "Locked," Carter reported, examining the ancient-looking iron mechanism. "Mr. Blackwell, we need the key to this door." From above, Blackwell's voice called down, still defiant despite the obvious trouble he was in. "I don't know anything about any door. This must have been here when I bought the property. Previous owner must have built it." The officers exchanged skeptical glances. Williams instructed his colleagues to search Blackwell and the immediate area for a key. One of them noticed a small hollow in the stone wall beside the staircase, partially concealed by shadow and easily missed. Inside was an iron key, green with age, but apparently functional. "Found a key," the officer reported, handing it to Williams. The deputy inserted the key into the lock, which turned with a loud metallic groan that echoed up the stairwell. The door swung inward, revealing a dark tunnel beyond, and with it came a smell damp earth, mold, and something else. The unmistakable odor of human habitation. "We're entering what appears to be a man-made tunnel," Williams narrated, his voice now hushed and tense. "Approximately 6 feet high, 3 feet wide. Walls are stone and earth, supported by wooden beams at regular intervals. There's evidence of relatively recent construction despite attempts to make it appear older." The officers proceeded cautiously through the tunnel, which extended for what appeared to be several hundred feet. The passage curved slightly, and Father Michael realized with a jolt that it must lead in the direction of the former chapel site, exactly where he had found the air vent. After a few minutes of walking, their flashlight beams playing across the rough walls, the tunnel widened into a small chamber. The camera's light revealed crude furnishings, a thin mattress on the floor, a bucket in the corner, a small table with the remains of what looked like food. The walls were covered with religious carvings, crosses and saints etched into the stone with painstaking care. Then, from the shadows, came a whispered voice, so faint it was almost lost in the audio feed. "Help ... is someone there?" Deputy Williams directed his light toward the sound, and the camera revealed a frail, elderly woman lying on the mattress. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken but alert. Her gray hair was closely cropped, almost shaved, and she clutched what appeared to be a hand-carved wooden rosary. Her clothing was little more than rags. "Ma'am," Williams said gently, approaching slowly to avoid frightening her. "I'm Deputy Williams, from the Shasta County Sheriff's Department. We're here to help you. Can you tell me your name?" The woman's cracked lips moved, forming words with visible effort. Her voice was barely audible, weakened by years of disuse and suffering. Sister Elena Torres." In George's car, Father Michael gasped, his hand flying to his mouth. Tears sprang to his eyes as he whispered, "My sister. Dear God, it's my sister." George placed a steadying hand on his arm, his own expression one of shock and disbelief. Through the body camera, they could see that the small chamber was lined with more religious carvings, crosses, saints, biblical scenes, all apparently created from scraps of wood and stone over many years. A single candle stood on the makeshift table, long since burnt out. On one wall, a large cross had been meticulously etched into the stone, and beneath it, scratched, in smaller letters, were names and dates. "Sister," Deputy Williams was saying, his voice professional but kind, "we're going to get you medical attention right away. Can you tell me if there's anyone else down here with you?" The woman's gaze shifted to a dark corner of the chamber, where the camera's light had not yet reached. "Ruth," she whispered. "But she's gone to God now. Many years ago." The camera panned to reveal what appeared to be human remains, a skeleton lying on a similar mattress, partially covered with a tattered blanket. The bones were arranged peacefully, as if someone had taken great care in laying out the deceased. "We need the medical team down here immediately," Williams said into his radio, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "And notify the forensic unit that we have human remains as well. Possibly more than one set." Deputy Carter had moved deeper into the chamber, his flashlight revealing a second, smaller alcove. "Williams," he called out, his voice strained. "There are 2 more back here." Father Michael's heart sank as the camera panned to show 2 more skeletons. These also carefully arranged, with makeshift crosses placed above them, carved from wood scraps. 4 nuns, Father Michael whispered. There were 4 nuns. Margaret, Dorothy, Ruth, and Elena. Unable to contain himself any longer, Father Michael bolted from the car, ignoring George's protests and the deputy's earlier warning. He ran toward the police perimeter where an officer attempted to intercept him. "Please," Father Michael begged, tears streaming down his face. "That's my sister they found. I'm Father Michael Torres. She's been missing for 23 years. I must see her." The officer, recognizing the name from the earlier briefing, spoke into his radio. After a brief consultation with Deputy Williams, he escorted Father Michael through the perimeter to where the forensic team and paramedics were preparing to enter the tunnel through the shed. "Wait here, Father," the officer instructed. "They'll be bringing her out soon. The medics need space to work." Time seemed to stretch into eternity as Father Michael waited, alternately praying and attempting to process the reality of what was happening. His sister was alive. After 23 years, Elena was alive. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, activity at the shed entrance increased. Officers emerged first, securing the area, followed by paramedics carefully maneuvering a stretcher through the narrow opening. On it lay Sister Elena, so thin and fragile she barely made an outline beneath the blanket, covering her. Her skin was pale, almost translucent from decades without sunlight. Her eyes were closed against the fading daylight, even though the sun was nearly set, still too bright for someone who had lived in darkness for so long. As they passed where Father Michael stood, her head turned slightly, perhaps sensing his presence. Their eyes met for just a moment, and despite the ravages of time and suffering, he recognized his sister. Those eyes, Elena's eyes, that had once sparkled with youthful devotion, were now wells of unfathomable experience. But the soul behind them was unchanged.
Her lips moved, and though no sound emerged that he could hear over the bustle of activity, Father Michael could read the words she formed. God ... never left me. As the paramedics rushed her toward the waiting ambulance, another group emerged from the shed carrying body bags, 3 of them. The remains of sisters Margaret, Dorothy, and Ruth. Father Michael realized, finally being brought home after 23 years. In the midst of the activity, he spotted Marcus Blackwell being led away in handcuffs, flanked by 2 officers. The man's earlier arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by a sullen, defeated expression. As Blackwell passed where Father Michael stood, he suddenly lunged forward, straining against the officer's grip, and spat directly at the priest. The spittle landed on Father Michael's cheek. "Proud of yourself, Father," Blackwell snarled, his face contorted with rage, destroying a man's life over some religious fanatics who got what they deserved. The officers yanked him back roughly, but Father Michael simply wiped his face calmly. His voice was steady, filled not with anger but with profound sadness as he replied, "I count it for joy that I have suffered just like my Lord, and I will pray for your soul. Mr. Blackwell, as my sister surely has these many years." The words seemed to strike Blackwell harder than any physical blow could have. His face crumpled, and for a moment, genuine emotion broke through, not remorse. Exactly, but something more complex. Then the officers led him away toward a waiting patrol car. Father Michael overheard fragments of conversation between officers discussing what they had found. One mentioned that Deputy Carter had discovered a 4th chamber, containing what appeared to be Blackwell's personal effects journals, photographs, and other items that would be crucial evidence. George appeared at Father Michael's side, having followed at a more cautious pace, his face pale with shock. "The ambulance is ready to leave," he said gently. "We should follow them to the hospital." Father Michael nodded, his heart too full for words. Together, they returned to George's truck and followed the ambulance as it sped away from Marcus Blackwell's property, sirens wailing, carrying the miraculous survivor of a 23-year nightmare toward the light of freedom at last. The lights of the emergency room entrance cast harsh shadows across the ambulance bay as the paramedics wheeled Sister Elena through the sliding doors. Father Michael and George had arrived moments behind them, parking hastily and rushing toward the entrance, only to be intercepted by hospital staff. "I'm sorry, Father," a nurse said firmly but compassionately, physically blocking his path. "You can't go with her right now. The medical team needs space to work. She's in extremely fragile condition." "I understand," Father Michael replied, though every fiber of his being yearned to stay by his sister's side. "But I am her only living family. She's been missing for 23 years. I thought she was dead until today." The nurse's expression softened with sympathy. "The doctors will do everything possible for her, I promise you. There's a waiting area just down that hallway. I promise someone will come speak with you as soon as possible." Reluctantly, Father Michael allowed George to guide him to the waiting room, a sterile space, with uncomfortable chairs and outdated magazines scattered on side tables. The two men sat in silence for several minutes, the magnitude of the day's events too overwhelming for casual conversation. Finally, George spoke, his voice hushed with awe. "It's a miracle, Father. After all these years, to find her alive. A miracle indeed." Father Michael agreed, his voice thick with emotion, "though I fear what she must have endured to survive." "She had her faith," George said simply. "Sometimes that's enough to sustain a person through anything." Father Michael nodded, drawing comfort from the thought. He recalled the religious carvings that had lined the underground chamber, evidence that even in the darkest captivity, his sister had maintained her devotion to God. She had turned her prison into a chapel, her suffering into a testament of faith. "I should call St. Anthony's," he realized suddenly. "The congregation should know she's been found." As he reached for his phone, it rang in his hand. The screen displayed Deputy Williams' number. "Deputy," Father Michael answered, "I'm at the hospital. My sister is being treated now." "That's good to hear, Father," Williams replied. "I'm calling to update you on the investigation. We've secured Marcus Blackwell in custody, but he's refusing to speak without his attorney present. However, we found something significant when we searched the underground chambers more thoroughly. A journal, actually. Multiple journals. It appears he's been keeping detailed records for decades." Father Michael felt a chill run through him. "What kind of records?" "It's disturbing content, Father. I need to warn you of that." There was a pause, as if Williams was choosing his words carefully. "The journals contain extensive writings about his hatred of the Catholic Church and religious women in particular. There are entries dating back to the late 1970s describing his obsession with the nuns at St. Catherine's." "But why?" Father Michael asked, struggling to comprehend the depth of hatred necessary to commit such crimes. What possible motivation could he have had? There was a brief hesitation before Williams continued. According to his writings, Blackwell's mother abandoned him as an infant, leaving him with his grandmother. She later became a nun, joined a convent when he was just 3 years old. He never knew her, never even saw her after that. His grandmother, who raised him, was apparently a strict Catholic who physically and emotionally abused him in the name of religious discipline. Belt whippings for minor infractions, forcing him to kneel on rice for hours while praying. He developed a pathological hatred of nuns in particular, seeing them as women who abandoned their natural duties to families in favor of what he called false piety.
Father Michael closed his eyes, a wave of sadness washing over him. Such brokenness, he murmured. Such twisted thinking born from pain. There's more, Father, Williams continued, his voice grim. The journal details what happened to the other nuns. The 2 older sisters, Margaret Flores and Dorothy Chun, apparently died within the first year of captivity. Given their age and the conditions they were kept in, it's not surprising. The cold, the damp, the stress ... Will quotes. May their souls rest in peace, Father Michael whispered, crossing himself. Sister Ruth survived longer, nearly a decade according to Redwood's entries. She died in the mid-1990s from what appears to have been an untreated respiratory infection. He describes her death in clinical detail, without remorse. And my sister? Father Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. How did she survive, when the others didn't? Williams hesitated again, longer this time. Father, there are aspects of Blackwell's journal that are particularly distressing. He seems to have developed a fixation on Sister Elena. He kept her separate from the others after Sister Ruth's death, moved her to a different chamber. There are photographs and other evidence that suggest he subjected her to degrading treatment designed to break her spirit. Father Michael gasped, a surge of nausea rising in his throat. Dear God, no. I'm sorry, Father. The evidence indicates he was physically and psychologically abusive toward her for years. He documents his attempts to force her to renounce her vows, to curse God, to admit that her faith was meaningless. But according to his own frustrated writings, she never broke. She never gave him what he wanted. It's remarkable, extraordinary, really, that she maintained not just her sanity, but her faith under such conditions. My sister didn't sin, Father Michael said firmly, as much to himself as to the deputy, his voice shaking with emotion. She was a victim. Whatever happened to her, the sin belongs entirely to her captor. Of course, Father, Williams agreed solemnly. No one would suggest otherwise. She's a survivor of a terrible crime. But I thought you should know, because the doctors may find evidence of past trauma, and you should be prepared for that. Harold, who had been listening to Father Michael's side of the conversation, placed his abortive hand on his shoulder, squeezing gently. There's one more thing you should know, Williams continued. The journal details how he managed to abduct 4 nuns without anyone finding them. It was a meticulously planned operation. Blackwell had been watching St. Catherine's for months before 1985, learning the nuns' routines, when they came, how long they stayed. When he learned they would be alone for the retreat with no one else scheduled to visit, he saw his opportunity. How did he get them without leaving any evidence? Father Michael asked, recalling how the investigation had been hampered by the complete absence of signs of struggle or forced entry. According to his writings, he posed as a friendly neighbor bringing supplies. He'd done it before, established himself as harmless, helpful. He brought tea and food to the chapel that morning, claiming he'd heard they were on a fast and wanted to help sustain them. The tea was drugged with a sedative he'd obtained through veterinary connections. The 2 older nuns drank it gratefully and became drowsy within minutes. When the younger nuns helped them to bed, concerned about their sudden fatigue, Blackwell entered and overpowered them one by one. Father Michael's heart ached, imagining the scene, the violation of trust, the terror his sister must have felt. Williams continued. He started with the older nuns, who were frail and easy to subdue in their drug state. Your sister nearly escaped. According to his journal, she fought back fiercely, scratching his face, and almost made it to the chapel door. She was screaming for Sister Ruth to run. But he caught her, knocked her unconscious with a blow to the head, then went after Sister Ruth. He drugged them more heavily after that, kept them sedated for days. Father Michael winced, tears streaming down his face as he imagined his sister's terror and her desperate, failed attempt to save herself and her sisters. He removed them through a side door of the chapel late that night, loading them one by one into his vehicle while they were still unconscious. Afterward, he spent hours meticulously cleaning the chapel. He burned all their personal effects, their bags, letters, journals, bedding. He washed the floors with lye to destroy any DNA evidence, though forensics weren't as advanced back then as they are now. By the time the alarm was raised days later, there was nothing to find. And the police investigation? Father Michael asked, remembering the frustration and helplessness he had felt during those early weeks. Rural investigations in 1985 weren't what they are today. Williams explained with regret in his voice. Resources were limited, forensic techniques were less advanced, and record-keeping was spotty at best. Once the initial searches yielded nothing, the case quickly went cold. Blackwell himself was never considered a suspect. He was wealthy, respected in the community, had no criminal record. He'd made donations to local charities. No one suspected him. And then he bought the chapel, Father Michael concluded, the pieces falling into horrible place. Exactly. He purchased it through a proxy company in 1988, demolished it to ensure no one would ever search there again, then constructed the underground chambers over the next year. That explains the reports of nocturnal construction noises and tremors in 1989 that George mentioned. How could no one have noticed? George interjected, his voice raised in indignation. Father Michael relayed the question to Williams. The deputy sighed audibly. It's not something I'm proud to report, but Blackwell's journal suggests he bribed certain local officials to ignore complaints and look the other way during the construction. We'll be investigating those allegations thoroughly. Some of those officials may still be alive and will need to answer for their actions. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a Maiva, doctor in scrubs who approached with a clipboard in hand and a serious expression on her face. Are you Father Torres? Sister Elena's brother? Father Michael quickly ended his call with Deputy Williams, promising to speak again soon, and turned to the doctor. Yes, that's me. How is my sister? The doctor, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes but a grave demeanor, took a seat across from them. I'm Dr. Chun. Your sister is in stable condition for now, but I want to be frank with you about the seriousness of her situation. Her health is extremely compromised. Father Michael braced himself. Please, tell me everything. She's severely malnourished. Her body weight is approximately 75 pounds, which is dangerously low for someone of her height. She has significant muscle atrophy from prolonged confinement and lack of movement. She's suffering from vitamin D deficiency due to complete lack of sunlight for over 2 decades, which has affected her bone density. She shows signs of multiple healed fractures that were never properly treated: ribs, fingers, her left wrist. There's evidence of old injuries consistent with physical abuse. Father Michael closed his eyes, each word striking like a physical blow. Dr. Chun continued gently. The most immediate concern is reintroducing her to normal environmental conditions safely. After decades underground, her immune system is severely compromised. Her body has no defenses against common pathogens that the rest of us encounter daily. We need to be extremely careful about potential infections. Additionally, her eyes are highly sensitive to normal light levels. Even the dimmed lights in the ICU are causing her discomfort. It will take time for her to adjust. When can I see her? Father Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She's being settled in the ICU now, Dr. Chun replied. We need to be extremely cautious about visitors. Anyone who enters must wear full protective gear, mask, gown, gloves to minimize the risk of introducing any pathogens. Even with those precautions, I can only allow very brief visits initially. 5 minutes at most. I understand, Father Michael said, though the prospect of further delay was agonizing. I've waited 23 years. I can wait a few more hours if it ensures her safety. Dr. Chun smiled gently. She asked for you, you know? One of the first things she said when she became more alert was her brother's name. She said she knew you would find her eventually, that she'd been praying for it every day. Tears welled in Father Michael's eyes at this revelation. She never lost faith. Apparently not, Dr. Chun agreed. The paramedics reported that she was clutching a rosary made from what looked like wood scraps and threads pulled from clothing. She refused to let them take it even during the initial examination. We finally had to promise we'd give it back to her after we sterilized it. That kind of devotion is remarkable. That sounds like Elena, Father Michael said, a sad smile crossing his face. Her faith was always stronger than mine, even when we were children. She used to say that faith wasn't about understanding God's plan, but trusting it even in darkness. She needed that faith for the recovery ahead, Dr. Chen said seriously. Beyond the physical challenges, there will be psychological trauma to address. 23 years of captivity will have effects we can't fully anticipate. We'll have a psychiatrist evaluate her once she's more stable, but recovery will be a long process. We'll face it together, Father Michael said, with quiet determination. She's not alone anymore. You'll be able to see her in about an hour, Dr. Chun promised, rising to her feet. A nurse will come get you when she's ready for visitors. In the meantime, try to rest. You look exhausted, and you'll need your strength for what's ahead. As the doctor departed, Father Michael turned to George. Would you mind if I spend some time in the chapel? I need to pray. Of course, George replied. I'll wait here in case there's any news. Father Michael made his way to the small hospital chapel, a modest space designed to accommodate various faiths. Finding it empty, he knelt before the simple altar and bowed his head. Thank you, Lord, he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. Thank you for this miracle. Thank you for preserving my sister through her ordeal. Thank you for leading me to her after all these years. Thank you for the mysterious chanting on my radio, for the broken fence, for every small thing that led me to that air vent. He continued in silent prayer for some time, wrestling with the complex emotions that surged within him. Joy at his sister's discovery, grief for her suffering, anger toward her captor, gratitude for her survival, and lingering questions about why God had allowed such evil to persist for so long. Eventually, a sense of peace settled over him. The mysteries of God's ways remained, but Father Michael found himself accepting that some questions might never have satisfactory answers in this life. What mattered now was that his sister had been found, and somehow, through unimaginable darkness, her faith had endured. Perhaps that was the real miracle. Not just that she had survived physically, but that her spirit remained unbroken. When he returned to the waiting room 45 minutes later, George was speaking with a nurse who had come to escort Father Michael to the ICU. After donning the required protective gear gown, gloves, mask, and shoe covers, he followed her through a series of doors to a private room where his sister lay surrounded by medical equipment. Monitors beeped softly. 4 lines delivered fluids and nutrients, and oxygen flowed through a nasal cannula. The figure in the bed barely resembled the vibrant young woman who had disappeared 23 years ago. Sister Elena's face was gaunt, her cheekbones sharp beneath paper-thin skin. Her complexion was unnaturally pale, almost translucent from decades without sunlight. Her closely cropped hair grown out slightly from what must have been a recent shaving was completely white, though she was only 47 years old. Yet when her eyes opened at the sound of his footsteps and found his, Father Michael recognized immediately the inner light that had always defined his sister, a spiritual radiance that even the darkest captivity had failed to extinguish. Elias, she whispered, using his childhood nickname. Her voice was thin but clear. Elena, he replied, tears streaming beneath his protective mask as he gently took her frail hand in his gloved one. Her bones felt as delicate as a bird's beneath his fingers. I never stopped looking, never stopped praying. A ghost of a smile touched her cracked lips. I knew you wouldn't. I told Ruth before she went to God. I told her my brother would find us someday. I'm so sorry it took so long, Father Michael said, his voice breaking. Sister Elena shook her head slightly. the movement obviously causing her pain. "God's timing," she whispered. "Perfect. Always perfect." I had to learn ... complete surrender, complete trust. 23 years in darkness to finally understand light. The profound theology in her simple words struck Father Michael to his core. After everything she had endured, she spoke not of injustice or suffering, but of spiritual lessons learned. Did he ... But Father Michael couldn't finish the question, couldn't voice his fears about what she had endured. Elena seemed to understand. "He tried to break me," she said quietly. "Tried to make me curse God, renounce my vows. He failed. Every day, every night, I prayed the hours, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, compline. I kept the liturgy alive in the darkness. I carved the stations of the cross on my walls. I turned my prison into a chapel. The carvings we saw," Father Michael said in wonder. "You created all of those?" "Over many years. Scraps of wood, pieces of stone. It gave me purpose. It was my witness that God's presence cannot be imprisoned by walls or darkness." The nurse touched Father Michael's shoulder, indicating his 5 minutes were nearly up. He nodded, understanding. "I'll be right outside," he promised his sister. "I won't leave the hospital. We have so much time to talk about when you're stronger. Tell me one thing," Sister Elena whispered as he prepared to leave. "The church, is it still strong? Did my sacrifice mean anything?" The question took Father Michael's breath away. After 23 years of imprisonment and abuse, her first concern was for the church. He squeezed her hand gently and smiled beneath his mask. "The gates of hell have not prevailed against it," he assured her, quoting Christ's promise in the Gospel of Matthew. "And your witness, your faith through all of this will inspire countless others. You've shown that nothing can separate us from the love of God." Sister Elena's eyes closed, a peaceful expression settling over her features. "Deo gratias," she whispered. "Thanks be to God." As Father Michael left the room, he felt a profound sense of wonder. Despite everything she had endured, the captivity, the abuse, the loss of her sisters in faith, the decades stolen from her, Elena's first concern was not for herself, but for the church she had served. It was a testimony to a faith that transcended circumstances, a faith that had sustained her through 23 years of darkness and would now guide her return to the light. In the weeks that followed, the story of Sister Elena's rescue became national news. The discovery of a nun who had survived 23 years of captivity captivated the public imagination, and reporters descended on Redwood Springs seeking interviews and details. Father Michael, following Elena's wishes, declined all media requests. Elena herself, through her doctors, released a simple statement. "I thank God for my rescue and for the faith that sustained me. I pray for the souls of my sisters who did not survive, and I pray for the soul of my captor, that he might find the peace that eluded him in life. I ask for privacy as I continue my recovery and rehabilitation." The simplicity and grace of her message, especially her prayer for Blackwell's soul, moved millions who heard it. Marcus Blackwell, facing multiple charges including kidnapping, false imprisonment, and 3 counts of murder, died by suicide in his jail cell 3 weeks after his arrest. He left behind no final statement, no expression of remorse. His journals became evidence of a mind twisted by childhood trauma into something monstrous. The diocese held a memorial service for Sisters Margaret, Dorothy, and Ruth. Their remains finally laid to rest in the cemetery at St. Anthony's. Hundreds attended, including many who had known the sisters decades ago. Sister Elena, still too weak to attend, asked Father Michael to speak on her behalf. He read a letter she had written in shaking handwriting. "My dear sisters in Christ served faithfully until their final breaths. In our captivity, they showed me the meaning of grace under suffering. Sister Margaret, even in her fear and pain, led us in prayer until she could speak no more. Sister Dorothy taught me that peace comes not from circumstances but from God's presence. Sister Ruth sang hymns in the darkness until her voice was stilled. They died as they lived witnesses to faith, hope, and love. Their sacrifice was not in vain, for through them I learned what it means to truly live the gospel, to love in the midst of hatred, to forgive in the face of cruelty, to hold fast to hope when all seems lost. There was not a dry eye in the church. 6 months after her rescue, Sister Elena had gained 20 pounds and regained enough strength to walk with assistance. Her physical recovery was slow but steady. The psychological recovery was more complex: nightmares, anxiety, struggles with enclosed spaces. But she faced each challenge with the same quiet faith that had sustained her through 23 years of captivity. She chose not to return to active religious life in a convent, instead accepting an invitation to live in a small cottage on the grounds of St. Anthony's, where she could be near her brother and begin a new ministry. That ministry surprised many. She requested permission to establish a prayer ministry for prisoners and victims of violence. "I learned in my captivity," she explained to the bishop, "that no one is beyond the reach of God's love. Both the imprisoned and those who imprison them need prayer. Both the victims and the perpetrators need healing." The bishop granted her request, and Sister Elena began writing letters to prisoners across California, offering spiritual guidance and prayer. Her unique perspective as someone who had been both victim and witness to the power of faith in extreme circumstances gave her words special authority. She also began speaking, when her strength allowed, to victims of trauma and abuse. Her message was simple but profound. Suffering can destroy us, or it can refine us into something pure. The choice is not in our circumstances, but in how we respond to them. I chose to see my prison as a monastery, my captor as a test of my faith, my suffering as a participation in Christ's passion. This did not make the pain less real, but it gave it meaning. 1 year after her rescue, on the anniversary of that spring day when Father Michael had heard the impossible, a faint hymn rising from beneath the earth, a special mass was held at St. Anthony's. Sister Elena, still frail but glowing with an inner light that seemed to grow stronger as her body healed, spoke briefly to the packed church. "For 23 years, I prayed for rescue, but God's answer was not what I expected. He did not remove me from my prison quickly. Instead, He entered my prison with me. He was there in every moment of darkness, in every hour of pain, and every tear I shed. He was there when my sisters died, holding them as they passed from this world to the next. He was there when I thought I could endure no more, giving me strength for one more day, one more hour, one more breath. My rescue, when it finally came, was God's timing, not too early, not too late, but exactly when it needed to be. Not just for me, but for all of you. My story is not about my suffering. It's about God's faithfulness. It's about the power of faith to sustain us through any darkness. It's about the day's truth that nothing, not captivity, not abuse, not even death itself, can separate us from the love of God. Some have called me a miracle, but the real miracle is not that I survived. The real miracle is that God took 23 years of darkness and transformed them into a testimony of light. The real miracle is that He took my captor's evil intentions and used them to create something that would inspire others to hold fast to faith in their own times of trial. I do not know why God allowed my suffering. I do not know why my sisters had to die while I lived. These mysteries remain beyond my understanding. But I know this: God wastes nothing. Every tear, every prayer, every moment of pain has been gathered up and woven into a tapestry of grace that is still being revealed. So I say to anyone who is suffering, anyone who feels abandoned by God, anyone who questions whether faith means anything in the face of real evil, hold on. Keep praying. Keep believing. The darkness is real, but it is not the final word. The light always prevails in the end. As she finished speaking, the congregation rose in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Father Michael, watching his sister from the front pew, wept openly, not tears of sorrow now, but tears of joy and profound gratitude. The mystery of the 4 nuns who vanished near Trinity Forest had finally been solved, but the story that emerged was not one of simple tragedy. It was a story of faith tested and proven true, of darkness that could not extinguish light, of evil that was ultimately overcome by love. 23 years of silence had ended not with answers to all questions, but with a testimony to the enduring power of the human spirit when anchored in faith. Sister Elena had entered a small chapel for a weekend retreat and had emerged 2 decades later from an underground prison, transformed from victim to victor, from prisoner to prophet. The ground had indeed concealed a horrifying truth, but it had also protected a living miracle, preserving a witness who would go on to touch thousands of lives with her story of survival, faith, and redemption. In the end, God had used what was meant for evil and transformed it into a testament to His unfailing presence, even especially in the darkest places we can imagine.